Learning a language is time-consuming. Flashcards is a less fun but efficient way. It's tough because most language learning gurus are exceptional, not because of their method, but either their motivation or they have a natural gift for it. I saw this comment on my flashcards video, and I found it to be representative of something dangerous that I think is deeply sewn into the minds of some language learners. The idea that you need to sacrifice fun in language learning for efficiency. I get this impression that what the commenter is saying is to learn a language, you have to focus on mechanics, you have to focus on memorizing words, memorizing structures. And if we grant that this is primarily how languages are learned, then I do think we reach the same conclusion of this commenter. Only the gifted people could possibly endure that kind of suffering. But the irony is that believing mechanics, words, and structures are what you need to focus on to solve a language is exactly what will stall your progress. I find this view of language learning sterile. That's the word I would use. I find it sterile. And I think that sterility, as opposed to lack of giftedness, is actually what breaks people in language learning. It's what actually keeps people stuck. What is going on, guys? My name is Nick. I'm the creator of Lengualytics and a fluent speaker of the Spanish language, and it's my opinion that the people who succeed in language learning aren't the people that can cram the most information into their brains, it's the people who formed the most emotional connection with the language. And I feel funny being the one to argue this because you guys know that I'm kind of an obsessive math and computer science person. I'm not usually the person that's arguing you need the right vibe to learn something. But in the case of language learning, this is an actual serious argument, and it'll affect whether you succeed or whether you fail. Because at the end of the day, your emotional connection to the language plays a huge part in your brain accepting or rejecting the information you're trying to feed it. We have to understand that when we take in information, our brains are constantly choosing what to remember and what to throw out. The things that our brain remembers the easiest are the things that we don't have to train it on at all. For example, when you're introduced to somebody you care about, you tend to only need their name once. When you're introduced to the hot coworker you work with at your job, you're only gonna need her name one time. But if you're introduced to a stranger that you really don't care about that much, you might forget their name and have to keep hearing it over and over and over before it sticks. We don't need to tell our brains to store our most emotionally charged memories. Our brains will do that automatically for us. They just get stored because they mean something to us. When we try to memorize words just for the sake of memorizing words, we're fighting against our brain's natural mechanism for storing information. We're basically saying, learn this word because I said so. It doesn't necessarily have any significance to me. I might not necessarily need to use it in the future. I may not necessarily hear it in any important situation, but you should still store this word. And you can store a lot of information in your head just by brute forcing it, but you cannot store an entire language in your head by brute forcing it, unless, again, you're gifted. So the question becomes, what does it look like to work with your brain to store information as opposed to fighting it? And the answer is basically the opposite of that sterile mechanics first view of language. It's to engage with input in the language that actually compels you, input that interests you on a personal level. Input you might be watching even if it wasn't in the language you're trying to learn. This is what I mean and what Pablo means and what Stephen Krashen means when we talk about compelling input. Compelling input is the kind of input that makes you forget you're studying a language. Where you're not tracking words and structures, you're legitimately curious at what comes next. You care about the person talking to you, or maybe you care about the story they're telling, or maybe they're giving you information that you actually find useful. When that happens, every word in the content you're watching comes preloaded with emotional significance. You don't have to argue with your brain on whether or not to keep that information. The answer is already yes, because the word was attached to something that mattered to you in the moment. When people say comprehensible input isn't working, the first question I have is, did you care about it? Actually, that's probably the third question. But it's a very important question. I truly believe the reason people say input doesn't work is because they're using input the same way they would use flashcards. People watch comprehensible input and focus solely on the words and structures. They're not falling in love with the language or the characters or the story. They're extracting language data from the input and sealing it in a sample jar in their mind. People are so focused on language mechanics and vocabulary words, they forget to actually do the important thing, which is enjoy what they're watching. And I want to be clear, you're not always going to be compelled by everything you watch. And it's totally okay to have curiosity about grammar and vocab words and all those things. But focusing strictly on language mechanics when you're watching input kind of defeats the point of input. It defeats the whole purpose of trying to watch interesting content. You might as well just throw anything on if all you're going to do is focus on the structure and the words and the grammar. I think curiosity about the language is healthy. What I don't think is healthy is is this like obsession with trying to cram information. The Dreaming Spanish subreddit is a perfect example of this. You can tell the people who are posting genuinely care about the people they're watching. They have parasocial connections because they watch these people so often. I felt this exact same way. Also, because the Dreaming Spanish personalities interact with each other, you're developing this next level of parasocial connection where you feel like you're involved in this big environment. And of course, that's going to compel people to really care about what's going on the screen. The audience is legitimately invested in the personal lives of the hosts. We spent a good amount of time talking about the importance of compelling input, but there's another aspect of sterility in language learning that I want to talk about here as well. There's the sterility of the actual consumption of the language, then there's the sterility of your conception of fluency. If you were to ask me whether or not I was fluent in Spanish at only 300 hours of comprehensible input, I think I probably would have said yes. My reason would have been simple. At around 300 hours is when interacting with my Spanish-speaking girlfriend became less like work and more enjoyable, more like fun. I wouldn't have thought in terms of CEFR exams. I would have thought in terms of, am I able to communicate with the person that I actually want to communicate with? Fluency was something I defined. It was highly personal and tied to my actual life. Did I have real, durable, general fluency at 300 hours? No. I made mistakes in every sentence. I was probably very hard to understand, and I only understood 50 to 60% of what my girlfriend was trying to say any given sentence. But it was enjoyable to use Spanish. And that was what I was chasing. I wasn't chasing some abstract, general definition of fluency. I was chasing something that I actually wanted to be able to do in my real life. If you do chase some abstract, general definition of fluency, I think you're chasing something that really doesn't exist. At a certain point, fluency in Spanish really breaks down and tends to mean, I don't know. My experience after 1,000 hours of listening to Spanish is that I can understand some people perfectly. Some people talk to me and I understand exactly what they're trying to say with no problems, while other people are just completely incomprehensible. There's dialect differences, there's differences in culture between Spanish-speaking countries, there's the slang of the younger generation, then there's the slang of the older generation. Also, you have rural speakers who you'll probably never even get to hear if you're only listening to your language online, and they can sound so different than the people you're accustomed to hearing. And we can't forget the people who just don't pronounce the words they're saying. So the question, am I fluent against some general standard, isn't really a question that has a straight answer. The only version of that question that has an answer, in my opinion, is, am I fluent enough to do the thing that I actually want to do? That's the metric that means something because it's the only metric that's tied to anything real. If your view of fluency is trying to pass an exam as opposed to doing something you actually really want to be able to do, you're giving your mind very few reasons to retain what it's being given in the long term. Language learning requires so much retention over such a long period of time that you literally can't do it without having some emotional investment or some actual tangible reason to convince your brain that this matters, to make your brain acknowledge that yes, we do need this. And I want to acknowledge that my situation is definitely more ideal than what most people are gonna have. Having a romantic relationship in the language you're trying to learn is the ultimate key to unlock compelling experience. But I can still give examples of how this principle affects my learning even now that I'm single. I literally feel like I say this every video, but I've been listening to the Harry Potter audiobooks and I'm on book 6 now. I watched the movies as a kid, so I had some general idea of the plot, which I knew would help make the content more comprehensible. And as a consequence of them interesting me, I've started watching this YouTube channel called Super Carlin Brothers that does this podcast breakdown of each chapter. And that's a podcast in English. The fact that that content appeared in my algorithm and I began casually consuming that content is a clear manifestation of the fact that the input I'm listening to matters to me. I would never describe me listening to Harry Potter as me building my wizarding vocab in Spanish. It's simply that I'm reading Harry Potter, it just happens to be in the language I'm learning. So behind all the debates about flashcards, tools, comprehensible input, sits a deeper debate about our perceptions of what we're really trying to do when we learn a language. And I think this might be one of the major differences between people who succeed and people who fail. It might come down primarily to who formed relationships with the language and who just tried to extract information. And if you are forming relationships with the language, it's only natural you'd gravitate to more input-based learning because input input is the only tool that's relationship first. That explains why the split might look like comprehensible input versus traditional language learning, but I think this insight might be the deeper distinction. And if you are trying to fall in love with the language using compelling input, I recommend you check out my website, Lengualytics, where you can find a user-sourced library of comprehensible input. It's completely free. You don't even need to sign up to look around. The link is always in the description, and I will see you guys on the next video. Please don't forget to like.